How to create change. The status quo and resistance to change. People with new ideas, whether they're neurodivergent or not, can feel like a threat to the status quo. And to be fair, there's nothing inherently wrong with the status quo. It exists because, for the most part, things are working. The ones who defend it most fiercely are usually the people who benefit from it. Now, imagine walking into a room and saying, "I have a brand new idea. There's no guarantee it'll work. Oh, and if it fails, you're all out of a job." Not exactly an easy sell. That's why most people don't start businesses. Most people aren't entrepreneurs, and honestly, they probably shouldn't be, because the odds of failure are incredibly high. Even if you have the drive, if you've got a family to support, the risk often isn't worth it. Statistically, there's a 90% plus chance a new business won't make it past the first 3 years. That's why I don't waste time trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced. It just leads to endless arguments. "I'm right, you're wrong." And the other side will always respond with the exact same thing. At the end of the day, both perspectives can be true depending on the context. For me, my approach to new ideas follows something called the law of diffusion of innovations, the bell curve. It's a framework that helps explain how new ideas spread and who's most likely to embrace them. The law of diffusion of innovations. In any population, you'll always find a range of performance levels: high performers, low performers, and, of course, the average. That's just how statistics work. Back in the 1950s, Everett Rogers wrote about this in his theory of the law of diffusion of innovations. He found that the first 2.5% of any population, the true innovators, are the big idea people. Think Steve Jobs or Richard Branson. Next, you have the early adopters, about 12.5% of the population. These are the people who are comfortable investing their time, money, and energy into something that aligns with their beliefs. They have a higher risk tolerance. They're the ones camping out for 48 hours to see a new Star Wars movie, when they could just wait 2 weeks and buy a ticket with no hassle. But for them, the experience is worth it. Then comes the majority, about 68% of people. They tend to be more skeptical and practical. Their first questions are, "What's in it for me? Will I get my money back? What happens if this goes wrong?" Finally, you have the laggards, the last 16%. They only change because they have no other choice. For any idea or product to achieve mass market success, it needs to reach between 15 to 18% adoption. That's when a social phenomenon called the tipping point kicks in, and momentum takes over. Why? Because the early majority won't try something unless they see someone else do it first. Here's the challenge: if you don't pay attention to this, you'll likely attract about 10% of people who already believe what you believe. And that's not enough to tip the system. That's where frustration sets in. Jeffrey Moore wrote about this concept in Crossing the Chasm: How to Move from 10% Adoption to that Crucial 15 to 18% range. What I learned is that you have to speak to early adopters differently. You start with why. Instead of focusing on what you do, talk about why you do it. Instead of laying out a plan, talk about the vision, the dream. The more I did that, the more I attracted early adopters, people willing to take risks and experiment. That's how I built my brand. No marketing budget. No PR. At the time, no social media. My strategy was simple: focus only on early adopters and lead with why. I learned how to connect with people on an emotional level instead of just focusing on products or facts. Of course, the product had to deliver in the end, but that wasn't where I started. Strategies for engaging early adopters. Start with why. That's how the system tips. I've seen it happen in companies, multiple times. So if you want to create change within your organization, stop trying to convince people. Let me give you a real-life example. Back when I first started spreading the Start with Why message, I was still figuring out how I wanted to share it. I was consulting because I needed every dollar I could get. I was living hand to mouth, literally down to pennies in my bank account. One day, a guy called me. He said, "I got your number from so-and-so. I've heard you do great work." And then he said, "Convince me why I should hire you." Now, as much as I needed the money, I had learned to recognize early adopters. And that phrase, "convince me why I should hire you," told me right away he wasn't one. So I simply said, "Don't." He was shocked. "What? I'm not the right guy for you," I told him. On the other hand, when people called and said, "You're onto something, it's not perfect, but I think you've got something here," I said yes every time. Even if they couldn't pay me a dime. Because those people let me experiment with their businesses. I would literally ask, "Can I try something new with your company?" And they'd say, "Yeah, go for it." That's the early adopter mentality. Find the people who want to try, who volunteer. Here's another real-life example, this time inside a big company. You'll like this. A major corporation, 100,000 employees, asked me to create a millennial leadership training program. I agreed, but only if we did it my way. See, this is how big companies usually approach new initiatives. They spend tons of money hiring the best experts to build a polished training program. Then they launch it with PowerPoints explaining why employees should participate. And what happens? People say no. The company insists, "No, really, this is good." But still, no adoption, lots of resistance. I know why. You can't introduce something new by handing it straight to the majority. So I said, "We're going to do it my way. And here's how we're going to do it." Creating demand through early adoption. Early adopters need some barriers, small ones. You don't want to make things too easy, but you also don't want to create too many obstacles. So I decided on a plan. I would teach the first class myself. We didn't have a full program in place. In fact, we had no program at all. We were just going to run this one class, and to get in, people had to apply. There were only 100 spots available, and everyone had to submit an essay to be considered. Once we made the announcement, people had to go through a real application process. It wasn't easy. We actually read the essays and carefully selected 100 participants. And here's the kicker, they had to come to New York for the training. No matter where they were in the country, they had to travel on their own dime, no extra money, no perks. On top of that, we set one major rule: no one born before 1984 could participate. That meant no senior leaders could sit in and spy on what we were doing. I was the only person in the room who was born before '84, and honestly, it was fantastic. We had an incredible time. At the end of the session, I told them, "This program isn't built yet. I need volunteers to help create it." But I was upfront, there was no extra money, no time off from their regular jobs, and no guaranteed promotions. The only reason to do it was because they believed this work mattered. Even so, 50 people raised their hands and volunteered to help. After that, everyone went back to their jobs, and I thought things were going great. But 2 weeks later, my sponsor at the company called me, furious. "You screwed me," he said. I had no idea what he was talking about. "What happened?" I asked. He told me that managers from all over the country were calling him, angry. Why weren't my people invited to this? Why weren't we included, they demanded. I just smiled and said, "That's called demand." We had created demand because the early adopters went back and raved about how incredible the experience was. No marketing. No PR campaigns. No PowerPoint presentations. Just pure word-of-mouth excitement. And the best part? Those same early adopters were now going to help us build the program. That's how you use the law of diffusion to push new ideas forward in a system that naturally resists change. Conclusion. In conclusion, change isn't about convincing everyone to jump on board from the get-go, it's about finding and empowering those first few who are willing to take a risk on your vision. Remember, even the most revolutionary ideas start small. By leading with your why and connecting on an emotional level, you lay the groundwork for a ripple effect that can transform the status quo. The journey may be challenging, and resistance is inevitable, but if you focus on building momentum among early adopters, you create a foundation strong enough to eventually tip the system. Embrace the fact that change is messy and unpredictable, and don't be discouraged by those who cling to the old ways. Instead, trust in your purpose and the power of genuine enthusiasm. So, whether you're spearheading a new initiative at work or launching a groundbreaking project, keep this in mind: bold ideas thrive when they're nurtured by a dedicated few who believe in something bigger. Stay true to your vision, be resilient in the face of pushback, and let your passion pave the way for real, lasting change.